What can we in the 21st century learn about the papacy and how to deal with the current papacy from the Church Fathers and the Apostolic Fathers? Suan Sonna is on to talk to us about this issue and much more. Stay tuned.
Now, you are a convert from the Baptist tradition?
Yeah, that's correct.
Tell me about that. How did that come? Because it wasn't even all that long ago, right, when you came into the church. It's fairly recent in the timeline here. So maybe you could start with that. Give us the elevator pitch. How did you get into the Catholic Church?
Yeah, so I entered the church, praise be to God, on May 31st, 2020. And basically, when I was in high school, I had some serious kind of intellectual growth where I thought about, why do I believe what I believe as a Christian? And I ended up running into St. Thomas Aquinas and other great natural law Catholic thinkers. And by the time I got into college, I had a good respect for Catholics and their intellectual tradition. I still thought they were wrong about Mary, the papacy, justification, all the big issues. And then it was during one of my college courses that we learned about the Reformation, and we learned about how the Reformation led to secularism. So how the Reformation basically led to this loss of tradition, this loss of a sacramental view of reality, and how it ended up affecting society negatively. And so I remember after that class, I kind of thought, man, I don't know if I want to be Protestant anymore. And I had a Catholic friend of mine actually invite me to Mass, and I ended up going every Sunday until I started asking questions, and then here I am.
That's amazing. Praise be to God. In my own journey, for me, it was the Holy Eucharist. I had to come to accept the Church's teaching on the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And to that end, it was the early Church Fathers. It was deep Scripture study. And when I said yes to the Church, I still said, Lord, I don't know about Mary and the saints. I don't know about that Pope, but I believe, help my unbelief. And the journey was more beautiful, in my opinion, as a result to just giving in to the assent of the will, even if you don't fully understand. But let's talk about the papacy in particular. Given the fact that, especially these days, there's a lot of debate going on about the papacy, the current papacy, power, authority, and whatnot. I find it fascinating because when I was coming into the church and when I was going through wrestling with these notions and looking at the early church, it's fascinating to see the role of the papacy in the earliest days. You've been debating a lot of Protestants on this very issue. Maybe you can take us through that journey. We have about 4 minutes before we go to break, 4 or 5 minutes.
Yeah, sure. So, I've done several debates on the papacy, debating Protestants, and then actually I have a really big debate coming up on August 5th with Gavin Ortland on Capturing Christianity, 12 p.m. Central. And so, do you want to know the biblical case for the papacy, or what are you interested in?
Specifically about the early church. I mean, it blew my mind that Clement sends a letter to the Corinthians. Who is this guy over in Rome? How dare he, interject himself into our local business? That is fascinating to me because he's like the fourth pope in line. I mean, so that's very early. He knew Peter himself, and yet he is expressing something that seems to be a given. How did you react to that as a Protestant?
Well, yeah. So, one of the things that I paid attention to as a Protestant was the Apostolic Fathers. And so what I wanted to know is just what did the earliest Christians say? Because going into my study of Catholicism, I knew about how New Testament scholars study ancient documents. And so I knew how even Protestant scholars would look at the ancient sources. And so I went in thinking, okay, I need to see Catholic stuff really early in Christian history, and then you read Ignatius of Antioch, you read Clement of Rome, you read, the Shepherd of Hermas, you read other documents that kind of show you, okay, there were very Catholic things being said in the early church. So when it comes to the papacy, Clement of Rome is universally attested in the early church as being one of the successors of Peter, right? And so, as you explained in First Clement, he writes a letter to the Corinthian church where he basically tells them that they don't have the right to depose their bishops who have served honorably, right? So the bishops and presbyters who have served honorably. And Clement is writing on behalf of the entire church. And this letter is dated by scholars are either before 70 AD, so this is before the destruction of the temple, or 96 to 99 AD. Either way, the Apostle John would have been alive, and so if he had a problem, he could have confronted Clement. Like, right, he could have said, Clement, what are you doing? You know, Peter didn't give you this power.
Yeah, let me remind you, I stood at the cross, and can you put a stop to this? You know, it's fascinating, isn't it? I mean, it's just utterly fascinating to realize that at the earliest days of the church, there is this papal authority it wouldn't have been called that at the time, but it was. I mean, if it acts like a duck, talks like a duck, walks like a duck, it's a duck. And here it is. And yet I wonder, there seems to be a micromanaging going on from the Vatican, down to the point where even local priests are being told what to do by the Vatican versus the local ordinary. How do you see the early church, expression of the papacy and papal authority versus today? Has there been a change in discipline, a change in procedure, a change in thought?
Well, I mean, so the development of the papacy is a bit of a complicated issue, right? Because there are times where you clearly see that the Bishop of Rome believes that he was given the entire church to care for, right? Mm-hmm. But then you have churches in the East that disagree. And so you do have these early disputes throughout the history of the church, which eventually do lead to the schism, right? But we also see that, the Pope will say certain things about himself, or even other people like, Maximus the Confessor will say things like, Rome has a universal supreme jurisdiction or something like that. And so, I mean, what you find in the first 1,000 years before the Great Schism is you have some people saying very clearly, the Roman Catholic Vatican I papal theological claims. And then you'll have in the East, people claiming kind of more Eastern Orthodox ecclesiology. The thing is that both views are there. And I would say that it seems to me that the Roman Catholic view is there pretty early on, but then you can find the Eastern view as well. But the point that I'm making is that, the papacy developed. And there are instances, even in the early church, I would say even in the New Testament with Peter, where you see a clear foreshadowing of what is to come, where you see the Pope or, Peter being the first bishop of Rome exercise incredible power. In Acts chapter 5, he rebukes Ananias and Sapphira, and God immediately backs his decision, and Ananias and Sapphira fall dead. And it says the entire church was afraid.
I want to go back to the idea and sort of exploring the concept of the early papacy versus what we're seeing today. And again, I think there's something to sort of this notion of micromanaging. It would seem to me that in the early church, although the papacy did express itself out of Rome, it did so sometimes at an arm's length distance. For example, if you go to like the councils, the Nicene Council, the Pope did not go. He sent a delegation on his behalf, but that was kind of a pretty common thing. Like the Pope would just be like Ambrose dealing with the Roman emperor and excommunicating him. Ambrose wasn't Pope. I mean, so you see what I'm saying? There seemed to be like still an arm's length distance there, even with his power, his authority, his office. Is that an accurate description?
Yeah, I'd say so. I mean, it's usually the norm of history is that the Pope will cooperate, or I should say the Pope will work with his brother bishops, right, to achieve the ends that he desires. But there are times, for instance, I think it's between Pope Stephen and Cyprian of Carthage, where they go head to head on the issue of baptism and whether or not someone has to be baptized again if they were baptized by a heretic, right? And so there are times in which the Bishop of Rome will very clearly say, no, you guys are wrong, or you guys have to change your opinion about this, and he'll kind of go beyond what seems to be his diocese, his jurisdiction in Rome, and he'll interfere. And so you have mixes of both situations, as you pointed out.
What I'm thinking of is the idea that today, the papacy is kind of in flux. I mean, it's kind of confusing of what's going on over there. Kind of like I was reading the Book of Gomorrah by St. Peter Damian, and it seemed like the situation at that time was so turbulent that the popes were declaring their predecessors anti-popes, and then the next predecessors saying that no, that pope was wrong. How do we respond in the modern era, looking at the church fathers and the apostolic fathers especially? How do we? What is our attitude toward the papacy? What should it be?
Well, I mean, I think our attitude towards the papacy is that we should understand that, Jesus Christ. So let's go back to the very beginning, the roots, right? Jesus Christ chose Peter to be the prince and head of the apostles. And, we know that Peter wasn't a perfect human being, and yet he was given the gift of infallibility. He was entrusted, by Christ, the keys of the kingdom of heaven, right? And so you see from the very beginning, someone who is flawed, but yet loved by God and desires, and desired as a leader of the church. And so what you see throughout history is you'll see the popes do great things. You'll see the popes sometimes make moral mistakes, right? But, when it comes to teaching theologically, there's never a mistake in terms of binding the whole church to error or, forcing others to bind themselves to error, right? And so, a lot of the church fathers, especially during the councils, they'll say things like Rome is spotless, or Rome does not have any stain of heresy, right? Or Rome hasn't kept, its places first among all the apostolic sees, and so on and so forth. And so I think our attitude should be one of respect. It should be one of recognition of the office that Christ built. But then there is that recognition that, sometimes the individual who sits on the chair of Peter, maybe we disagree with him, right? And as Catholics, we're free to disagree to some extent, within prudence and understanding the magisterial authority that he's exercising. But yeah, respect for him, but also an informed kind of recognition of what he's doing.
See, it seems to me that the early church, the Apostolic Fathers, really held to almost, at least from my perspective, an ultramontanist position. And for those who don't know, ultramontanism basically says that the Pope is like all powerful, essentially. He cannot be wrong. He's practically impeccable. And so, but that seems to not be the case whenever we look at Vatican I, which of course comes over 1,000 years, nearly 2,000 years after the Apostolic Fathers. So how do we reconcile the Apostolic Fathers with the modern interpretation of the papacy?
Yeah, well, I think so. I think one of the big things about Vatican I is that, so the first thing is that Vatican I begins from Scripture, right? And so I've done a lot of work on the biblical case for the papacy. And so I think that the biblical grounds for the papacy, like Matthew 16 and 19, John 21, 15 and 19, I think those are actually really solid and underrated kind of defenses of the papacy. And then when it comes to the Apostolic Fathers and the earliest Christians, one thing to note is that nobody questions that Peter had successors to his ministry in Rome. Okay, so they recognize that much. And then you'll see the early church fathers talking about like the centrality of Peter. So the primacy of Peter never comes under question. And then eventually there's talk of the chair of Peter, right, upon which the successors of Peter sit, and so on and so forth. And so, I mean, I think the best way to go is kind of what St. John Henry Newman said, which is, sometimes doctrines do develop. And when it comes to something like the papacy, when the church is still itself developing and growing around the world, there are still bishops being, ordained and still church structures developing around the world. It's really hard to imagine like the Pope exercising universal jurisdiction if the whole jurisdiction of the church hasn't exactly been scaled out just yet, you know what I'm saying? And so, you clearly, as I said before, you find like really strong endorsements of papal authority, and then sometimes you find some pushback, right? And so, the first 1,000 years of Christianity, it's very turbulent.
Suan Sonna is our guest. He is Intellectual Conservatism on YouTube. You should check that out. I'm curious, as a convert, when I became Catholic in 1999 Easter Vigil, the bishop who confirmed me that night was embroiled in the sex abuse crisis. He was served under cardinal law. He helped to move around these credibly accused priests. And when I discovered that after, I was a little scandalized by all that. That freaked me out. Now, I naively didn't even know about any of that stuff. Did you come into the church knowing, you had to have, how could you have not known about some of the scandals going on in the church the last many decades? And what was your take on all of that?
Yeah, so obviously, I go into the church and I know about a lot of the controversies, a lot of the history, and, people were telling me, Swan, you better watch out if you join the Catholic Church, right? But the thing is, like, the reason why I joined the Catholic Church was because of my love for Christ and my desire to be totally obedient to him. And so what mattered to me was the question, did Christ build a church on this earth, and how did he build that church? Because I want to be in that church, because I want to be with Jesus, right?
Yeah.
And so the more I looked into that question, the more eventually I became convinced of the Roman Catholic claims, especially on the papacy and other issues. And then,
go ahead.
I remember it was during the 2016 election, and my family and we became American citizens finally. And, people are saying, why do you want to become an American citizen when everything is so divided and polarized and, American history, Swan, and all that. And I said, it's because I believe that America is worth being a part of. I believe that it's worth becoming a citizen, right? And so for me, when I was going into the Catholic Church, I believed that it was worth becoming Catholic, no matter the pain, the rejection, the misunderstandings from the world, because Jesus held on to me on the cross, and I'm not going to let him go when he needs me.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great point, I think, to make, because in spite of whatever goes on, whether it's scandal out of the Vatican, which we see quite frequently these days, or difficult topics that come out of the Vatican, like, for instance, Traditionis Custodes is a debate that's going on around the world at the moment about the Pope's comments on traditional forms of piety and liturgy. And still, the pursuit of truth is the primary mission that each individual must follow, in spite of it all. And I think that's fascinating, given the fact that so many people abandon the faith every single year.
Mm-hmm.
How has your family taken your conversion?
Well, at the start, it was pretty rough, because there was kind of denial and, questions on what are you doing? Why are you doing this? And so on and so forth. As time has passed, things have calmed down, of course. My sister, I have an older sister, and so she originally was kind of skeptical of why I was becoming Catholic. And then, she recently was received into the church this last Easter Vigil. And so she became Catholic as well. And, she has a very good devotion to the Blessed Mother. And so there are mixed responses from my family in terms of with my sister, things are great. In terms of my parents, they still remain Baptist. And so there is still some tension.
I can imagine. I've gone through it in my family. I'm the only Catholic in my family at this point.
Oh, man.
It's been a battle. But what was the biggest hit roadblock for you? The biggest issues? Was it the papacy? Was it Our Lady? What was the biggest one?
Yeah, it's kind of funny because when it came to when I started asking the questions, and I started sitting down with a really intelligent Catholic convert by the name of Andy Brandt, he began going through the Bible with me and showing me the typology between Mary and the Ark of the Covenant is just there. And for me, because I'd been trained in philosophy, I'd been trained in apologetics and New Testament studies, I was able to say that is there. I can't deny it. I'm not going to use my prior theology to start filtering the evidence, right? Maybe the biggest struggle for me was, I don't know, I don't know why, but for me, the Lord just kind of made it really easy for me to accept the Eucharist, Mary, the papacy, and justification, right? Once I saw the biblical evidence for it, so I think maybe the biggest roadblock was Mary, because I was kind of immaculate, that was kind of the big one, Immaculate Conception, Mother of God, that makes sense because Jesus is God, Mary's the mother of Jesus, the logic's kind of, the logic's airtight. So yeah, I think the things about Mary were difficult, but when I got my stuff on the papacy and the magisterium together, I realized that, okay, yeah, we have a good defense of the Blessed Mother.
Yeah, for me, it was the 1-2 punch of the early church fathers and the scriptural evidence for it. It becomes very, very clear very quickly at that point. But we're out of time.
If you like that interview, then be sure to check out some of our other interviews that you might find fascinating. And don't forget to like and subscribe and share this interview with someone that you think will find this informative and inspiring. God love you.